Jewess, that beautiful Jewess of old with her dark brown eyes, her curly brown hair, her physical and spiritual vulnerability in a world that is overwhelmingly hostile to her and her kinsfolk. When positively portrayed, i.e. not Salome, who asks for John the Baptist's head on a platter, or the titular La Jewess from Jacques Halevy's play La Jewess, who denounces her Christian lover and gets boiled in a cauldron for her pains, the Belle Jewess is not an intrinsically evil archetype. Rather, her beauty absolves her of being affiliated with the rest of her kinsfolk. Rebecca from Ivanhoe, Jessica from The Merchant of Venice, me in my freshman year of college trying to be contrarian. There's a long history of Jewish girls equal parts beautiful and pious, absolving their kinsfolk of their perceived faults by shacking up with a nice goy guy. Now in the case of Rebecca, she actually ends up being shunted to the side for a nice goy girl, but hey, at least she's a credit to her race. Now what's notable about these goodly Jewish girls is that they all err on the side of boring, at least compared to their Christian counterparts. True, Jessica does exert her agency to leave her abusive father's household, but it's her Gentile counterpart Portia who, spoiler alert for a 427-year-old play, gets to dress up in drag in literal court and cleverly tricks Shylock into admitting the impossibility of his gaining a pound of Antonio's flesh without drawing blood. Rebecca does tend Ivanhoe's wounds during a tournament and bravely rebuffs a seduction attempt, but it's her rival love interest, Lady Rowena, who is the direct descendant of the Saxon kings of England and, titillatingly enough, is Ivanhoe's own foster sister. And no other works of fiction exemplify this unfortunate dichotomy better than the 19th century's Daniel Deronda and the 21st century's Nobody Wants This. George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, published in 1876, came out during a time where the Jews of England had been fastidiously and unsuccessfully attempting to assimilate into outerlying Gentile and genteel society since their expulsion from England in 1290 by King Edward I's decree, and after their return to the country by Cromwell's decree in 1656. And though George Eliot was widely considered to be one of England's most celebrated national authors at the time, by no means did Daniel Deronda's publication completely reshape Anglo-Saxon perceptions of Jews, though it contained an unprecedented positive view of Jewry. The novel prominently features two distinct plot lines. The first centers on the beauty and haughty Gwendolen Harleth, who has to contend with her family's sudden loss of generational wealth, her subsequent marriage to the abusive Grand Court, and her burgeoning emotional reliance upon Daniel Deronda as a friend, spiritual mentor, and prospective love interest. The second plotline is much more unconventional. It centers on Daniel Deronda, a young man living with a kindly benefactor who he suspects of being his biological father, but who is constrained by polite society from admitting so. One day, Deronda rescues a pretty young Jewish woman named Mirah Lapidoth from committing suicide in the Thames, and is tasked with finding her long-lost mother and brother so that they might shield her from her financially abusive father. During his attempt, he becomes slowly entrenched in the Jewish community of London and is taken under the wing of the sickly and prophetic Jew Mordecai. Upon reading the novel, Eliot's contemporary author Henry James found that the Jewish part of the book was, at its bottom, cold. In 1902, the father of Virginia Woolf, Sir Leslie Stephen, surprise, surprise, stated that the novel was merely two stories put side by side, and disparagingly described Deronda as an angel at a London dinner party. A pithy phrase which, I might add, Oscar Wilde wholeheartedly concurred with, as he took great pains to seemingly directly parallel Deronda's finer qualities with the grotesque-looking Jew in the picture of Dorian Gray. During the novel's 100th anniversary in 1976, Cambridge Don F.R. Leavis stripped the novel of its Jewish part and called the ensuing fanfiction Gwendolen Harleth, though his version thankfully never saw the light of day. The general consensus from critics was that the novel would be much stronger without the Jewish subplot. And though, spoiler alert, Deronda ends up with Mirah at the end of the novel, it's Gwendolen who is the more compelling of the two women. She's spirited and proud, she's conscious of her beauty, and it is a point of pleasure for her as much as a point of pain. She doesn't want to get married and rebuffs the advances of her infatuated cousin Rex and Grand Court while playing coy with them all the while. And she is the deliverer of my favorite exchange in the entire novel and perhaps the entirety of the Western canon regarding Grand Court. Juxtapose this with Mirah, who lacks Gwendolen's dynamic personality. Instead, she is dainty, feminine, and merely longs to be reunited with her beloved mother and brother, whom she was taken away from by her father as a child so that she might perform in the theater. Mirah is quite simply the embodiment of the good belle juif, a sweet, pious, if inexperienced Jewish woman who adores her ostensibly Gentile suitor and who generally lacks any sour note. She is the Betty to Gwendolen's Veronica, passive and sweet and essentially uncomplicated, even if she has an incredibly complicated past and upbringing. And don't get me wrong, I do love and sympathize with Mirah, and I am incredibly jealous that her actress got to kiss a young Hugh Dancy. But it is a fact that her character isn't as compelling as Gwendolen simply because she is not allowed to have faults. And I'm not trying to accuse George Eliot of one-dimensionalizing Jewish women. There's actually quite a lot of fascinating female character archetypes in Daniel Deronda, which I'll touch on later. And I do think that in making Mirah the more palatable female character to a Victorian audience, George Eliot was doing something unprecedented and groundbreaking in an already unprecedented and groundbreaking novel. But I do find it troubling and constraining that this is a dichotomy that has been adhered to in fiction that boasts both Gentile and Jewish female love interests well into the 21st century. Case in point, Nobody Wants This, Netflix's hit 2024 TV show which recently got renewed for season 2. Nobody Wants This follows Joanne, a Gentile sex podcaster who falls in love with Reform Rabbi Noah. Now, I have lots of problems with Nobody Wants This, perhaps the most glaring being that it has really weird oversights to the character's Judaism. I mean, at one point in the series, Joanne brings a charcuterie board to Noah's parents under the misapprehension that prosciutto means beef. This is a woman who is in her mid-30s, by the way, and also is supposed to be tech-friendly by virtue of her career choice. And Noah, who is the soon-to-be head rabbi at his congregation, doesn't inform Joanne that even had she been right and prosciutto meant beef, it would still be as unkosher as if it had been pork by virtue of beef and cheese being on the same platter. But this is just one of many seemingly minuscule problems that eventually snowball and become something really weird and kind of problematic, or at the very least unsavory to watch. My real problem with Nobody Wants This is how it characterizes Joanne as opposed to Noah's ex-girlfriend and Joanne's rival love interest, Rebecca. We only end up seeing Rebecca around the third or second last episode of the series, where she screws around with Joanne's sister who's surreptitiously trying to gather information on her on Joanne's behalf, and Rebecca responds by callowly insinuating that Noah wants to get back together with her. But even this was only because she knew that it was Joanne's sister trying to coerce information out of her. Now, in terms of good belle juif versus bad belle juif, Rebecca is a mixed bag. She's accomplished, ambitious, cares about family and religion, but is also really overstepping her boundaries with Noah and can be petty, hence her manipulative exchange with Joanne's sister. But this is all charted territory for Jewish women who have been historically and contemporarily accused of the same faults. Petty, high-strung, overbearing, micromanaging, with variations really just depending on your age and perceived beauty. In fact, all of the Jewish women of Nobody Wants This, from Noah's ex-girlfriend, to his mom, to his sister-in-law, to his sister-in-law's coterie of wags, display at least 2 of these faults at any given time that they're shown on screen. The only Jewish female who escapes this treatment is Miriam, Noah's niece, who is a literal child and thus incapable of providing an obstacle to Noah and Joanne's relationship. Now compare Rebecca's treatment to Joanne, a co-podcaster with her sister who predominantly talk about sex and relationships in an inferior facsimile to something like Why Won't You Date Me with Nicole Byer, or alternatively a decent parallel to something like Call Her Daddy. Though outwardly confident and outspoken, Joanne is hesitant at accepting genuine love and attention from a potential partner due to her upbringing with inattentive, self-absorbed parents and a string of failed relationships. She's funny and acerbic but still has her moments of poignancy. She loves her sister, and she's authentic enough to realize that she isn't compelled enough by Judaism to undergo a conversion. All in all, she's a pretty fully realized character, which is what makes the one-note nature of her rival that more jarring. Unlike Joanne, Rebecca isn't a person. She's an amalgamation of traits that the writer's room generally attributes to Jewish women. And while George Eliot may have failed in providing Mirah with faults, she more than makes up for it with Daniel Deronda's mother, who, spoiler alert, is a Jewish-born princess who provides a wonderful parallel to Mirah in that she actually lived to perform on stage, but was constrained from pursuing it as a career by her own father, a religious man who imposed rules upon her pertaining to her gender that she fundamentally disagreed with. Not only that, but she also provides a parallel to Gwendolen, as both had their pick of men, were outspoken and fiery, and both actually wanted to pursue performing as a career choice, though external events and people forced them to choose otherwise. And don't get me wrong, the princess does contain faults that would have been immediately obvious to a Victorian audience. She very callously rejected motherhood and presumed upon the affections of a man who wished to marry her to look after her only son, and her disavowalment of Judaism could be considered a disavowalment of religion at large, which was a big no-no at the time. But her faults aren't traditionally Jewish woman faults, perhaps because she so emphatically distanced herself from Judaism. I think that's the reason why, besides Mordechai, the princess is my favorite character in the novel. She is the most three-dimensional Jewish character that exists. And besides Gwendolen, the most three-dimensional character in the entire series, Gentile or Jew. George Eliot managed to do what an entire writer's room funded by Netflix could not. She managed to create a Jewish woman whose faults did not stem from grossly misogynistic and anti-Semitic perceptions about Jewish women, but faults that were born of her innate personality and whims, callous though they may have been. The point is, though, that it's the callousness of a woman born with a passion for a specific career in a specific medium, who lives in an unforgiving time to an unforgiving father, not the callousness of a bejeweled oriental seductress or a hoarse-voiced Jewish bubby. I guess what I spent this entire video trying to say is that I deeply resent the motive allowed the Jewish woman. It's not the fun, messy that the flaxen-haired Gwendolen harlots and Joannes of the world can enjoy. It's unpleasant and snappish and deeply mired in anti-Semitic prejudice. And I reject it as both a Jew, a woman, a feminist, and a scholar. And as a person who knows intrinsically that within every woman, Gentile or Jew, lies a nuance waiting for the day that the cultural zeitgeist allows her to rear her multifaceted head and show herself to the world at last.